Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Carolyn Talks Television. I'm Carolyn Topol, and here is my fabulous co-host, Rachel Arnett.
Thank you. Hi.
Well, we are in a fabulous mood because we're going back in time for the next, I'd say about 3 episodes and introducing a special series about family viewing. Now, while I respect family values, that's not the theme. It's family viewing night.
Yes.
And what people tended to watch starting back, and we're going back to the 50s, because yes, we know there was television in the 40s, but there was this much television in the 40s.
And it was black and white. And
well, it was still black and white in the 50s, dear. just
I was
in case.
not there, so sorry.
For the record, neither was I.
I was not implied.
Okay.
She might have been.
Yes, I took my youth pill this morning, okay? But we're going back, and today's episode, we're going to go back to the 50s and the 60s. So for those of you who remember them, join us in this great episode talking about family viewing and see if our ideas coincide with what your family did. And those of you who weren't there, see if you can get some of the hints, and we may actually just throw some of the hints out there. This is not about foreshadowing,
No.
about what might have happened in the future shows that started with these 50s and 60s shows that developed very different styles of family viewing as the decades progressed. I'll say one of the things that I thought as going through all the programs, because we don't just come on here and say, well, what the heck are we going to talk about?
I do. I don't, I promise.
No, she doesn't. She doesn't, because I make her look at what I learned.
It's true.
Is that the 70s and the 80s were a huge leap, but many of those shows reflected back to these 50s and 60s shows.
Yep.
So let's begin, starting in the 1950s, before our time. However, not really. Thanks to television, we learned a lot and saw a lot in the lovely land of repeat.
Yes. Oh, the thing is, I've seen these shows. As much as I joke about the fact that literally, it's impossible for me to have seen them when it was on. Same thing for you. I've seen at least a few episodes of the majority of these shows because of different networks that replay them.
That's right. Replaying, for example, we also have all these shows, or many of them are even on YouTube now.
Yeah, that's true.
People have recorded and uploaded these shows for posterity.
Yeah. And even Hulu and Netflix and some of the streaming services have brought on some of the old shows because of, for whatever reason, in the zeitgeist of the moment, somebody brings up, the Honeymooners on an episode of Girls, and all of a sudden there's this revamped interest in the Honeymooners.
And we even have networks now on typical cable that's part of your cable plans, like TV Land, Cozy, which have parent companies they're affiliated with in the big networks frequently, but what they're showing are these old series. And they're actually showing the series.
Yeah,
they're not just showing one episode.
TV Land network is all about.
Right, yes. And in fact, they spend a lot of time on 70s programming, but they do 70s, they do 80s. And then we have Cozy that's, there are times I've just sort of been channel cruising, and I'm seeing things like Adam 12, and I'm like, okay, that's way back there. Now we're throwing it back like as far as you can throw it. So in the 50s, first of all, TV viewing, for the most part, was all about families watching families. And whether your family was an ideal family, they wanted to see ideal families and either mimic them or doing whatever they could do to make themselves like them or just live vicariously through them. You had shows that were so pure that being black and white was even hard to be. They were just, golden with halos all over them. And I'm going to start with one, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, which was so popular and so incredibly welcomed into homes that it actually lasted through the mid-60s. That show did not go off the air.
I didn't realize that.
That it went until 1966.
Wow. That's a heck of a lot of range for a show that started in the 50s to sustain an audience. It's something that a lot of shows now struggle with, to sustain an audience and quality over a long period of time.
And people literally watched Ozzie and Harriet Nelson's children grow up on television, become amazing performers in their own right, and producers, directors, singers, and they started their own little mini legacy, because Tracy Nelson became an actress, a very well-acclaimed actress. She's the granddaughter of Ozzie and Harriet.
I never even made that connection.
So you have these amazing people, but people watch them do all kinds of cute little things that their kids would do, and they watched and they laughed at them and they had to solve their problems. It was the true situation comedy.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's so many shows now that you could say are descended from that style. Mm-hmm. The whole sitcom approach, in a lot of ways, is based on normal people doing normal things, and they're funny and cute because they connect with us in some way. We laugh and roll our eyes at the dad because the dad's being so dad jokey and hokey and weird, and we connect with that.
And we also connect with, which is interesting, in many of these shows, including shows like Leave It to Beaver, which also had a really long lifespan. It lasted till 63, where the mom is frequently the one with the answer, but yet is still wearing a beautiful dress and pearls and washing dishes. I can honestly say I've never worn pearls in my kitchen in my life, except crossing through it on the way to a wedding.
Well, that's because you are not on one of these 50s TV shows.
There you go.
I know that there's so much feminist theory about the 50s and the era, but there is something, like you said, that there was this ideal mother who, she loved her kids. She was perfectly put together, hair beautifully coiffed at all times. But, oh boy, when those kids got in trouble, you better wait for daddy. You better wait for dad to come home. But the mom was never totally removed from it.
And one of the things that I liked about them is, and this is part of the innocence of them and the idealism of them, is wait for dad to come home. And if you're a family viewing this who doesn't have such a functional family, and yes, dysfunctional family goes way back. It goes back to family, period.
I mean, it's not a recent development?
Okay. And with that eye-opening discovery, it's not a recent development. So when you have your maybe not completely functional family watching this, you can see that sometimes things can be done in different ways. For example, wait till your father gets home in the Leave It to Beaver attitude, or the Ozzie and Harriet attitude, or the father knows best, which was also in the 50s. Dad didn't come home and, for lack of a better term, take his belt out of the closet.
No.
He sat and he spoke and he listened and he made choices. Now, frequently the choices were certainly saccharine sweet.
Oh, absolutely.
Everything got tied up in a nice ribbon. 30 minutes went by and you left going, because it just was left like that. And that was on purpose. That's what they wanted to show.
Well, when I think of 50s TV in general, they did often address things that were slightly uncomfortable, but it wasn't at all to me like TV shows now, which really try very hard to dig into the nitty-gritty. There was kind of always this bright surface veneer of everything's going to be okay and everything's tough. And there was, what I kind of see is this 50s idealism, post-World War II, people needed to see happy, positive things. And I think television and that escapism gave them that in so many ways.
I think that's very true. I think
needed to see that,
in a nutshell, that's
that
very
strong
true.
Nuclear family. We needed to see that the good guys won at the end of the day. We needed to see that. Whereas
we did.
TV now is really focused very heavily, especially on streaming services, as uber realistic, where your favorite characters are dying 2 episodes in, and then you're left sitting there like, oh, okay, cool, life is hard. Great, thanks.
Right, where the truth now is sort of slapping you in the face. Back then, they sugar-coated it, and that was okay because that's what people needed to see was the sugar-coating. On another vein, which we have these wonderful families and they're all built together, then you had a different kind of a sitcom like I Love Lucy.
Oh, I love Lucy. It's very strange, but there's so many episodes from I Love Lucy and information about I Love Lucy that for whatever reason just sticks with people. Everyone can think of the episode where they're shoving the candies in their mouth after they get a job.
Or Vitamin Vegemin, where she's plastered because medication back then, including on shelves, not just by prescription, had alcohol in it. And we laugh at it now, but it was so camped up and it was hilarious. And they knew they did that. This was on purpose. This was Lucille Ball's best self. Yeah. Was really making it all about her and laughing it up with everybody.
And I thought that show, when I look back at, given the era, there were a lot of things that they really pushed the line.
Oh, they totally did.
The fact that they, for all intents and purposes, had an interracial marriage, what we would now define as an interracial marriage.
And they didn't want Desi to be the spouse on the show.
Exactly.
I mean, they were appalled, and she was like, no, the reason we're doing the show is so I can have my husband home with me.
Yep.
So, and
the fact
Lucille
that they
Ball,
listened to her and realized that this woman is the lead of this show, and this show is her show. That's a lot of power for a woman to take back in the 50s, I think.
Without question, without question.
The fact that she was pregnant on the show.
So she was having a baby.
Sorry, having a baby, not pregnant.
She was having a baby.
Say pregnant.
You couldn't say pregnant, and they were in twin beds, which really cracked me up because as she was pregnant, she was still in twin beds, and I thought, wow, that was creative.
You think even with some of the things that they encountered on the show where people wouldn't believe that he was her husband, there was one episode, I can't remember what it was, where he got detained in some fashion, and there was this, it turned into a typical comedy of errors.
Right.
But there's this sense of humor underlying even these difficult moments, which I think is what in a lot of ways made that pushing of the line palatable for an audience that may not have been quite ready for it.
I think you're absolutely right. And they also introduced, I think personally, they were truly the show that introduced the next door neighbor who was an integral part of their lives.
Yes. Well, and I think of the relationship between the neighbors and their marriage.
Fred and Ethel Mertz.
Thank you.
Fred and Ethel Mertz.
And I think of then that relationship and how that marriage was and how it was then reflected in later shows where you see a husband and wife bickering and arguing, and it's funny and not horrifying to see these neighbors bickering or to see the married couple bickering. And I think
they did that a lot more than the other shows did. Yeah. They had, well, I would definitely not say it was an honest view of marriage.
No.
They had Lucy cross the line almost every show.
Oh, absolutely.
The situation was always Lucy crossing a line.
Absolutely. She did wrong.
She frequently.
Yeah, she did.
But in the most humorous way. Mm-hmm. And how, of all things, the show, I Love Lucy, what they did was they showed that he dealt with it, sometimes in an even cornier way, or that they somehow came together in the end. Mm-hmm. Because they were married and they loved each other. Because it was about him loving Lucy.
And still at the end of every episode you get Lucy and or whatever.
Right.
And it's just that classic. It was a sitcom that was like a classic sitcom, but they made it their own. And even despite a lot of controversy, I still remember learning about when she was being investigated by the House Un-American Act Committee. And he said the only thing red about Lucy is her hair. And that was like this big statement that they came out because she was genuinely being investigated because he was from Cuba.
Right, that's Lucille Ball, of course,
Lucille
not the
Ball.
right,
Not
right,
the character.
not the character.
Sorry, distinguishing.
right.
Yeah,
but exactly, yeah. It was very, very silly that happened, and then once again, it was really all about development because even with a child on the show, because they introduced the show just before she became pregnant with her second child in real life. And rather than, oh my God, how can we hide this for 9 months? She was like, really? It's not going to happen that way, you know? So incorporating a child in a show that was really meant to be about two couples, primary couple, secondary couple, it worked. They made it work for many years. This was not a show that lasted 3 years.
And it was not perfect, which I think was so important, that they kind of took that ideal nuclear family and spun it on its head by the parents making the mistakes. It wasn't like, oh, Beaver, you done it again. It was like, Lucy, what are you doing? Which, to show the parents kind of messing up, again, was revolutionary. The parents weren't these perfect, idealized figures.
And that's why people got funny phrases like, Lucy, you got some splaining to do.
Yes.
And then we switched to a couple of different kinds of things. Once again, the Honeymooners built like I Love Lucy as the two couples. A child never getting involved in this because neither of the women who were the leads, two leads, became pregnant, and ultimately led to another version of the Honeymooners later, where there was the Jackie Gleason show. So he was able to bring his show and evolve it to becoming more of one of the entertainment palettes with dancing and sketches later. Good on him, and the show wore itself out. Interestingly enough, I think I Love Lucy survived longer partly because there was a child that was brought in, because that was more appropriate. It
was more appropriate, and it creates fresh takes that you can do.
Yes.
At a certain point, you can only do the exact same formula for so long, so injecting the parenthood and the child allowed for new plots to kind of branch off and develop, I think.
Absolutely. Now, there's two other shows we wanted to bring up about the 50s before we move on to the 60s, in what little time we have left. We wanted to talk about Gunsmoke, one of the earliest Westerns. However, it was such a good show, it lasted till 1975 because it didn't involve honeycoating anything in many respects. Yes, frequently after the show, which was a long format, it was an hour long. I'm pretty sure it started as an hour long. I wouldn't give myself 100% on that, but it definitely developed into an hour long. That I remember watching it growing up when I was a teen, and later in my elementary school years. It actually spent a lot of time, not only were you in the sheriff's office with the good guys, but the good guy had a relationship with the one who owned the saloon.
Which did not happen.
She was the saloon woman, and many times, you know, I mean, it was really forward thinking in many ways. They evolved from black and white to color because they lasted so long. And I have to say, in many ways, because of a lot of acceptance and interaction of a variety of different characters, who many of which had flaws. They were flawed characters, and not flawed in a funny way like Lucy was, but flawed, excuse me, in a funny way, in a serious way. They had flaws. They made mistakes. They used poor judgment from time to time. I think that's what made that show last. And almost, to me, is a huge foreshadowing to When Calls the Heart, or a show like that, where you have, in fact, When Calls the Heart, in many respects, is much fluffier than Gunsmoke ever was. Because Gunsmoke had a lot more of the gunfight, catch the criminals, and it was not always pretty. Yet it survived the 50s and the 60s to go halfway into the 70s.
Well, I just think, you think to all of the Western shows that have come about, would they have come out and been successful if Gunsmoke hadn't set the stage? Would Deadwood have come out and been so popular?
You're absolutely right. Yes.
And Deadwood was a show that lasted on HBO for quite a few years, but it hit all different age groups. And I think a part of it is, like you said, Gunsmoke lasting so long, setting the groundwork that people were able to see, even though they were completely different shows in the way that everything was handled. There's still, when you're dealing with Westerns and the West, there are tropes and things that get carried through that seem familiar.
And James Arnett leading that head as Gunsmoke's star. My guess is the show went off the air probably because he was kind of done.
Yeah, sometimes, 15, 20 years of a show will do that.
You're right.
It'll do that.
And now we're going to quickly move into the 60s.
Can I talk about Gilligan's Island?
You can start with Gilligan's Island. This was something that Rachel's dying to talk about.
I love Gilligan's Island. I love everything about it. except the remake they tried to do. It's fine. We'll forget about it.
No remake. It's a plot.
The episode that I remember most from Gilligan's Island was when somehow the Harlem Globetrotters ended up on the island and had to face off against a team of robot basketball players for whatever reason. Like, I have no recollection of why they were facing them in a basketball game. I don't know how they got on the island and off the island. I don't know why our island dwellers did not leave the island with them. But I just remember that on Gilligan's Island one day, this ridiculous notion of the Harlem Globetrotters facing off against a robot.
I actually remember that episode too. No one can forget it, truthfully.
And it's weird because even though that's such a bizarre concept, it didn't seem bizarre for Gilligan's Island. Like, the whole show was such a conceit that it kind of worked.
And you know, truly, Gilligan's Island is the ultimate precursor for shows like Lost.
Oh, absolutely. Any Lost on an Island, but Castaway, like anything, there's a reference somewhere.
There's got to be. And the other thing, I have to say, this is a show I do remember watching when it first aired. And I used to have a fight with my little friend who I went home from school with and stayed with because I had one of the few moms that worked. So we didn't have daycare back then, so you went home to mom's friend's house with your friend. And I have to say, it was on opposite, now wait for it, Mr. Rogers.
Ooh.
And I used to have to practically promise the world to my friend so we would watch Gilligan's Island because I liked it better than Mr. Rogers.
And this is not DVR. You cannot DVR
we also didn't have VCRs either. Nobody had a video camera in their house. There was no way to save that except for summer repeats. That's how they did it. You'd see the season again in the summer. And that was the end of the story. So it was a big deal to get to watch Gilligan's Island when I went to her home when it aired originally. And it was worth it. Every second. Hilarious. People in a situation that could have been nowadays, this would have been the most sexually charged show going. And instead, it was just humor, funny. And there was definitely some undercurrent. And I think that's what made the show thrive with adult viewing and family viewing. I watched it with my friend's family all the time.
And the constant debate of Ginger versus Marianne and like America's Sweethearts versus the actress and
the professor who was he ultimately going to end up with. And clearly nobody, which was even stranger.
Let's call it a precursor to The Bachelor too. Let's do it. Why not?
There you go.
That love triangle thing that's so common in so many shows now and any form of media really.
And the fact that Gilligan and the skipper never seemed to be interested in either one of them was always sort of funny.
Well, it's funny because when I think of Gilligan's Island, I just think of enjoying myself and watching and laughing. And there's so many pieces of it that are now kind of built into popular culture. Like the 3-hour tour is
it will be a joke forever.
Students that I have will make some kind of joke about 3-hour tour and have no idea that the reference is to Gilligan's Island. But somehow that 3-hour tour disaster has become kind of built into American culture. And I think that says
hilarious. A lot about the show, which did not last that many years, actually.
I think that's probably a good thing, though, because you can only do so many things on an island before you're like, all right, go home.
Right.
It's kind of the same issue Lost had. Like at a certain point, you gotta really try to get off the island.
Right.
At a certain point.
Now, I'm going to go through a few shows now, and these were truly family viewing shows with a very different flavor than the 50s. Bewitched is probably the closest you get to it, except that, of course, she's a family of witches.
We're also not going to talk about the remake of Bewitched.
No. I'm skipping remakes here, folks. No. Batman, which, hello, talk about multi-million, maybe $1 billion now in the movies, all started with this hilariously campy, and I mean, that's the ultimate in camp, is Batman. Zap, pow.
And the like smoke effects, the penguin, the guest stars on that show.
We're amazing. Other The Addams Family and the Munsters, that was family viewing night in my home. And we watched that and we loved it.
And I remember when I was little confusing the Munsters with the Addams Family, and then then from that moment I was like, oh yeah, no, these are totally different shows. Like they were both humorous, but they had very different styles of tackling like the odd family and the monstrous family. It was very interesting.
And once again, to this day, especially the Addams Family,
Oh, yeah.
they were such a popular show with people that they made movies, 2 of them.
And these remakes we can talk about because they are fantastic. They are so good.
Yes.
I loved both of the Addams Family movies. Actually, I saw those before I saw the original Addams Family, so I was very confused when I heard that there was a TV show. But the camp scenes in the original Addams Family movie, they're so good.
And I was a little girl at the time, and yet neither show frightened me. That's how well they were made. They were made for family viewing. I still remember Thing coming out of the box and being like, that's cool, as opposed to being horrified that there's a hand coming out of a box attached not to a body. And
Cousin It with all people still like jokingly call people Cousin It if their hair comes over their face.
Yes, when I dry my hair, I always think of myself as doing a Cousin It imitation. And then on top of that, we can't end the 60s without talking about Star Trek.
Which, I mean, how many movies, a new version of the show on TV now?
2 new versions. Oh, now there is, but there was iteration after iteration for a show that I think was only 2 or 3 seasons, maybe 4 at the most. It was so powerful. It had such a following.
And a lot of firsts. There was the first interracial kiss on the show.
First interracial kiss, sci-fi for families.
Yes.
Sci-fi for families.
It's not just for nerds anymore.
No, and now it made it so acceptable. I can't count the movies. I truly can't count the movies been made.
First generation, the newer ones with Chris Pine. Star Trek is its own universe.
It sort of was in my opinion, the precursor to Star Wars.
That is a dangerous thing to say.
I do believe that, and I'm a Star Wars fan, folks. Star Wars fan, but I do believe it opened the door to a movie like Star Wars being accepted by everybody, not just the geeky sci-fi community, which is what their old stereotype was, and it's not anymore. So on this note, leaving you with all these fun memories, we're going to say goodbye from Carolyn Talks Television. Thank you, Rachel, for joining me in this really big throwback. And next time we visit the 1970s.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.